peoples that we will meet. First of all is the woman that we're introduced to in the first two verses. The woman who stands on the moon, having the sun to clothe her, 12 stars upon her head. Some people argue there are really three visions or three versions of this woman. One is that she is the church at Rome. I don't think so. I don't think so. The Mother Church, some would call her. I don't believe so. I think most of that's all going to be decimated in the first half of the tribulation. The second argument is that it is the church. I don't think that's true either. She does not represent the church. The 12 stars on her head bring us to one place, and that would be to Israel. When you look at the description of her, Israel alone, the 12 tribes represented by those 12 stars up there, Israel alone brought forth a man-child, Jesus Christ. No church brought forth Jesus. Jesus brought forth, in fact, the church. So you couldn't put this as any kind of a church. But it does clearly represent the 12 tribes of Israel who gave birth to the Savior. And remember when he was born, how it says that the devil stood ready to devour the child? Remember Herod was there. And he had his armies, and they said, hey, find out where he was born. And then he sent in and slew every child there in Bethlehem. Clear picture that is given to him. And of course, the child, and again, this goes all to the timing of when this takes place. The child was later taken up to heaven. Jesus Christ, of course, after his death, burial, and resurrection, 40 days he went about preaching, and at the end of 40 days he was taken up into heaven. So we clearly see that then Israel giving birth to Christ and Christ being delivered up to heaven. All of this that we argue in this next chapter, and it's very important because a lot of people put the fall of Satan before the creation of the world. You can't. Because we're about to see after Jesus goes back to heaven, after his death, burial, and resurrection, after his ascension, after the church is already gone, then this war breaks out in heaven. I was telling you from the very beginning, you're going to witness this. It's going to interrupt your dinner up there, all right, when this takes place. And so we clearly see from this chapter here, the time frame. We know it is some point after Jesus returns to heaven that this war breaks out. So clearly did not happen in eternity past somewhere. It hasn't happened yet. Now, I'm not saying that the devil is not a good guy right now. He clearly himself has been deceived. But he hasn't been kicked out of heaven. Remember, Paul writes and tells us the same thing that John just said. He is the accuser of the brethren. He stands before, we see that picture in Job, when the devil comes before God and says, hey, why don't you get rid of that guy? Jesus says, no, I'll tell you what, you could test him, but you can't kill him. And of course, then we read the book of Job, and he went through an awful lot. But we see Satan in heaven a lot as we have gone through these first 11 chapters already of Revelation. We constantly have reference to him there. Now, problems are coming up. The woman, clearly Israel, clearly giving birth to the Messiah. The Messiah clearly went to heaven, Jesus Christ, after his resurrection. And so then we are brought about with the second. Oh, let me just share this with you, because some people apply this astrologically. And here is the sign, according to them, September 23rd, 2017. They take the constellation Virgo over here as, remember, this is a sign I'm going to show you in heaven. So the sign being the woman or Virgo, and you can see the sun enters into Virgo, and the moon as well is below her over here. And so you have the woman with standing on the moon, clothed with the sun, and they take that very literally. I have problems with that because 2017 means we're already, because this is the halfway point. This is the last 3.5 years of a 7-year period. In which case, that's 2 years away, So we should already be at least a year into the tribulation period. All right? So I'm not saying it couldn't happen. I'm just saying I think they are. The problem with this same sign also, though, took place in 2010. It's sort of a reoccurring phenomenon. So it's for somebody to pick this particular astrological movement and say this is it and it's going to happen at this particular date and time, I think you're stretching things because it's one of those reoccurring ones. I think what God's going to show them in the heavens is going to be clearly some sort of a sign, if you would. He saw the great sign, a wonderful sign in heaven, and then when the devil comes in, you notice he doesn't use a great sign or a wonderful sign. He just says another. Not as important, it's another sign. Okay? And so a lot of people, though, see this as the stars. Remember in the Magi, when they came to find the sun, they saw his star. And so the word that's used could fit this, because they saw a sign in the heavens, and the particular heavens that's used happens to be the constellational heaven, or what we would call space out there. So it could fit. I don't think it has to. I think everything you're witnessing in the book of Revelation is a little bit special. It's something that God is clearly doing. But this is, if you're looking for a worldly answer, if you need to somehow attach everything God says to the world, then you've got this. All right? Clearly, the woman clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet. Now, I don't see her 12 stars, unless maybe up there in Leo, that constellation gives them to her. Maybe so. But I think sometimes we try too hard to explain away the miraculous and what God is doing with an event. However, it is interesting that we could, if pushed to it, draw to a earthly, I guess natural might be a better word, a natural explanation to it. Next creature we came to, though, was the dragon, with his 7 heads and his 10 horns. Rather fierce. God's giving to people a warning, if you would, because he's going to say in verse 12 that woe to the inhabitants of the world. Now remember, when the angel first started out, he said there were 3 woes. He said, I pity you people, because there's 3 woes. The first woe, which we saw, was the release of the locusts and their king Apollyon, which is the same word that you and I would translate for the devil or for Satan. So those kingdoms, all the war that broke out, the tragedy. And then the second woe had to do with when the 2 prophets were brought on the scene and all the plagues that came upon man at that particular time. And then, of course, their death and their resurrection. Their ascension into heaven. And then the writer John says, and the second woe has passed. And then he doesn't mention a woe until you get here to 12:12, when he says woe. He never says it's past, because this woe is going to stick around for 3.5 years. We are clearly now getting ready for the second half of the tribulation. This is where the whole thing falls apart. God has been judging for 3.5 years the earth. He has judged nature. He has judged the men. We have seen in His grace those who are saved up to that midway point. Remember, our argument for the rapture of the church takes place in chapter 4, when the angel says to John, come up hither. And we base it all on that phrase, come up hither. We see that duplicate phrase take place at the calling home of the 2 prophets, when God says to, I believe, those that were saved during that period, and God says to them, all right, now you folks come up hither. And then He says to the world, now woe to you. I have given you chance after chance. He's even put this parenthesis in there where He has taken a break for just a little bit of time, trying to stretch the point to everybody about what's coming. Even in the heavens, He declares that the history of Israel, and pointing to the deliverance of Jesus Christ, His death, burial, and resurrection, and even His ascension back home. Historically, everybody's got to know that. And that's going to be published a lot. Remember, He already had the 144,000 out there publishing the gospel to people during that first half. And then he stops and he gives them a show in the sky, some wonders in the sky that tell this story over again. And then he lets them know what's going to start happening in chapter 13. Chapter 12 is a prelude to what takes place in chapter 13 when Satan hits the earth and begins his corrupt system, a false political system, a false religious system, with the devil running the whole show. It's really bad at that last half. Now, the first half, God sort of protected the saints and helped them to get saved. In that second half of the tribulation, the last 3.5 years, folks will still be allowed to get saved, but it's going to cost them their life every time they call upon Jesus Christ. It will be under great persecution. And so this first half of the tribulation wasn't really a whole lot outside of all the plagues and the diseases that were breaking out. As far as salvation went, it wasn't a whole lot different than our time. But that second half, when the devil is actually down here running things, this is when it gets really rough. Yet God is still willing. You're going to find that at the very end there is a remnant that shall be saved. The preaching of the remnant goes clear back through Genesis. There's always going to be a remnant of Israel. And that remnant will ultimately walk into the kingdom of God when Jesus Christ comes down, ascends from heaven with us, and begins his millennial reign. Those who have been saved in this last half will walk into that millennial kingdom and be part of it. But in the meantime, we have this dragon that takes place. A very common picture used of the devil throughout. And already we're seeing the 7 heads and the 10 horns and the crowns, and he's going to go into detail when you get to chapter 13 about it just a little bit more. Again, not a great wonder. He just says another wonder in the sky. With the woman, however, she was a great wonder. And then, of course, we discussed already the man-child. The only person we know who has died and ascended into heaven was Jesus Christ. And so we continue this. But he shows them this illustration, and then he says, now let me go back and explain it to you. And so he stops for a moment. By the way, when the woman was chased into the wilderness, all right, most scholars argue for the lost city, or it's not actually lost. If you watch Indiana Jones, you saw him ride into it. So, but this city of Petra, Christians have begun actually stockpiling food and Bibles in there. They've been doing it since the 70s. And they go in there and they clean it up and they replace all that food, because many, many Christian scholars believe that this is the place where Israel will retreat to. You could see Petra right down over here. Here we have Israel on this side, the West Bank, very common areas to us. And when the persecution comes, this is the area down here that we call the wilderness. Remember, it was called the wilderness of David. When David was being chased by Saul, he went into the wilderness of Judea. When Jesus was tempted by Satan, he went into the wilderness of Judea. Right in this area down here is that wilderness. They're going to cross over, and many scholars believe that Petra will be the place where they are going to be protected. And so Christians, like I said, at least since the 70s when I was a young person, been stockpiling food. That, again, as you come around this corner, very narrow path, easily defended, and they come around this path, and that picture probably very, very familiar to many who have seen it. Then the war in heaven breaks out. As I said, the rough thing there is that this is the place where we expected peace to be. Now remember, Satan referred to as the prince of the power of the air. He's going to come on down. He starts his battle there, does not win, has no victory. Sometimes people want to pretend like there's some struggle between God and the devil. There is no struggle. God simply has to speak and everything is done. Of course, in this particular battle, we're told that Michael, the archangel, that word archangel doesn't appear. The word Michael appears. We gave them these frames of archangels. We know, and so we sit there and we say, okay, Lucifer was an archangel, Michael and Gabriel. Because those are kind of like the 3 angels that are mentioned. Since he casts away a third of heaven, the devil takes a third. We then assume that each angel is in charge of a third. Michael's got a third, Gabriel's got a third, Lucifer has a third. It's sort of how we made it up in our mind. There's no biblical construct for any of that. You could divide them by 12, do anything you want. I don't care, because it isn't in the book. However, we do know this much, that the 1/3 number is given to us. Remember, the dragon drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven. Here, when the war is given to us, that same number is given. That Satan was somehow able to, and you have to wonder how, he was able to get 1/3 of the host of heaven to follow him against God himself. Now, the name Michael, some people argue whether Michael is just another name for Jesus, because the name Michael means who is like God. And I got to tell you, there's nobody who's like God. Of course, we know that in the Bible, Jesus Christ is referred to as the captain of the host of heaven. So a lot of people believe that this battle, then the charge angel here, if you would, is none other than Christ himself, who casts Satan out. Some people do go with the fact that there is, Michael is mentioned several times in the Bible, particularly back in Daniel. His first mention is given to us in Daniel, when the angel who brought the prophecy to Daniel said, listen, I was having trouble getting here. I've been trying to get here for like 2 weeks now. Finally, Michael came to my side and got me through. And so Michael is used several times, I think maybe 4 or 5 references in the Bible to the angel Michael. But again, the name means who is like God. And so it could be a reference to Jesus Christ, who is God in the flesh. But whoever, the battle is won, and Satan is cast out. And this is the tragedy of it, is when he gets kicked out, the third woe. Woe to the inhabitants. He says, first of all, notice the good news in heaven. You and I are all excited because while we're up there, who keeps ruining dinner for us? Devil standing up and saying, hey, Lord, how did Jack get to this table? Do you know what Jack did? And Jesus got to stand up again and defend us. Lord, how did Terry ever get up here? I can't understand why you ever let this guy into heaven. Of course, Jesus gets up, shows him the palm prints. Lord, this is why you let him in. Yeah, there's no good in him, and I'll agree with him on that. But he's here because of my blood, because of my sacrifice. And so finally, therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell therein. Why? Because the devil was thrown out. That accuser of the brethren is no more. But, second half of that verse, Revelation 12:12. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea. Now I got to tell you, as an old sailor, that part about the sea always troubles me. You know, because how come we get it? Go pick on the Marines, right? And so here we go. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath. You can imagine, he's mad at God and can't do anything about it. You can shake your fist at God all you want, it doesn't change anything. And so he's really ticked off, having great wrath. He is mad because he knows that he has but a short time. Devil always knows this. Devil knows his time is short. When we get to Revelation 12, it's always telling us that he's got 42 months, 1,260 days. It always comes down to 3.5 years. The clock starts ticking the moment he hits the earth. He's got 3.5 years before he's cast into the lake of fire. He knows it's coming. So if you were mad at God and you got 3.5 years and you got a lot of power, what are you going to do? Listen, if I'm going, I'm taking as many people with me as possible. That's the argument that a lot of crazy people have, and I wonder where they got it. Here's the father of all crazies right here. Hey, if I can't, the scorched earth policy, right? When Saddam Hussein said, if they come and get me, I'm going to burn everything. Hey, wonder where he got that idea. Same guy right here. Hey, if you come and take, my time is short. I've got just a little bit of time left. 3.5 years left when you get to this point. Actually, in chapter 13, the 3.5 years starts their countdown next week. And he's mad. He's angry. And he's got a third of the army of heaven backing him up. Who's going to stop him now? Nobody on this earth. Nobody could dare match that kind of power this side of heaven. And guess what heaven has just done? Heaven has just stepped back a little bit. God said, listen to those. Now remember, he has been struggling. He has been preaching. He has been teaching. The martyrs have been praying. Lord, how long before you stop all this foolishness? And finally in chapter 10, God said, tell you what, I'm about to stop it now. Then he gave us a quick overview in chapter 11, one of them little parenthetic statements that he likes to make, takes us out of time for just a little bit. And then again here in chapter 12, another parenthesis. See this long pause? God, whenever God is about to bring down the house, so to speak, he always inserts grace. And so we saw just before this kicked off, we had the preaching of those two prophets for 3.5 years, getting the world ready. For 3.5 years, with great power, they were able to do wonders in the heavens. They were able to destroy anybody who came after them. And remember last week, we saw how that they breathed fire out of their mouths and destroyed anybody who would attack them. Why? So the gospel was preached without interruption for 3.5 years. That's an awful lot of grace on God's part to people who have already been rejecting him. And finally he says, you have rejected, you have rejected, you have rejected. Tell you what, I'm going to give you what you want. I'm going to, listen, wanting something and having something are often two different things. You don't want me in control? You don't want me bothering you? Tell you what, I'll step back just a little bit. There's this other fellow you all been wanting. Tell you what, I'll send him down to you. You could run your life any way you want. Finally, all the evil, all the wickedness, all the vice that we might enjoy is finally going to be ours to enjoy. But it comes at a huge price. Huge price. The cross, man's only hope. Paul says this to us, for the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness. How does someone get to heaven? You get to heaven by trusting the work of Jesus Christ. How crazy is that, the world would say? Why, listen, preacher, you don't understand. I've been doing real good. I have done this. I have done that. I. Jesus reminds us of that with the story. He said 2 men went to the synagogue to pray. One a Pharisee, who stood there saying, Lord, I thank you, I am not like other men. For I give 10%. I walk old ladies across the street. And he goes on with all these good things that he does. In fact, he looks over and says, Lord, I thank you, I'm not like that sinful fellow over there. And in our story, Jesus says the publican, which was the most hated of all the people in Israel, because they were tax collectors for the Roman government, and nobody, it's kind of like the IRS guy, you know, nobody really likes him, right? And so the tax collector, we're told, doesn't even look up to heaven, but simply says, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus says, the tax collector, he went home, blessed of God. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness. There's a whole host of people who died during the tribulation period. We saw in the first opening volley, if you would, when the first trumpet sounded, 2 billion people, a third of mankind was killed off. In our day and time, about 7 billion people or so. So a little over 2 billion people are killed off in the opening shot of this tribulation period. And then a third of those that are remaining are taken out. And another third of those are taken out. And another third of those are taken out. Until you're left, by the time we get to the end of chapter 12 here, the population of the world is decimated. The ecology of the world is decimated. The economy of the world is decimated. There aren't really much lines and kingdoms left. And to such a time, the devil comes down. Those who have been rejecting Jesus Christ because the cross is foolishness to them. Well, I think you can get to heaven any way you want. Listen, the one who came down from heaven said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes unto the Father but by me. Can't get around that if you're a Christian. As a Christian, that's one thing you are not allowed to deny and still remain a Christian. Because Christian means follower of Christ. And if that's what he believed, then I have to believe it too, or I'm not his follower. How do I know you're my disciples? Because you keep the commandments that I gave you. This is my commandment. But unto us which are saved, it is the power of God. Something happens when you hear the gospel and you accept it. When I was young, I grew up believing that, hey, I'm not as bad as everybody else. That's the way I was taught. I was taught that God had this balancing scale. And if my good deeds should outweigh my bad deeds, I'm in. If my bad, however, outweighs my good, then I'm damned. But it's amazing because in our own mind, you ever notice how your good always outweigh your bad? Very beginning, what is the gift, if you would, that we received from the devil in the Garden of Eden? The right to determine what we think is right or wrong. That's why the Bible tells us, even under Paul, there's a way. Proverbs teaches us the same thing. There's a way that seems right to a man, but the end leads to destruction. You ever notice how you're always right? When you get in a fight with somebody, who's right? It's always you. The whole fight is always over your... And what does the other guy think? The other guy always thinks they're right. Unless you've been married, then right away you know it's your fault and she's right. History teaches us that, right? But whenever you get in a fight and an argument, you're always trying to prove your side. And we hold on to that tenaciously. It's a warning, if you would, that God gave us even back in Genesis. When Satan came and they ate of that fruit, and suddenly they knew good and evil. It's a little more ominous than the words sound like, because it wasn't that they knew what was right and wrong. It's that they could determine what was right and wrong. They knew in their own heart what was right. You know what's right? You ever notice that you do what's right and everybody else does what's wrong? It's a simple fact. It's a fact that those who refuse the cross will argue forever. When I was first told by the preacher that I was a sinner, I had trouble with that. I walk into his office and he says to me, you know, if you died right now, you'd bust hell wide open. Why, what did I do wrong? All I did was accidentally walk forward in a church like this, accidentally stand in front of this man, and when he asked me what I came here for, I said I thought I was leaving. And the whole church starts laughing and giggling because he's mic'd and everybody can hear me say it. So when he takes me to his office and walks in and says that to me, my answer to him, that's an awfully stiff penalty just for making folks laugh in church. But he brought to me Jesus Christ. I received him as my Savior. And suddenly, what was once foolishness to me became the power of God. There is coming a time, not very far off. I don't see how the world... Listen, look at what's going on in your world. Just watch the news and see if you don't think we're getting close. Aren't already the boundary lines in the Middle East beginning to fade? No one can tell anymore where this state is and that state is. They're all sort of beginning to merge. That is always your timepiece. People think America is the center of the world. We are not. Israel is the center of the world. Israel is always the timekeeper for what God is doing. What did their prime minister just come to America and say? He gave us a dire warning, dire predictions. These are the people that got all the guns pointing at them. These are the ones who Satan is going to chase into the wilderness. And what did he say? They're about to chase us into the wilderness. Center of the world? Israel. Is she worried? Yeah. If she's worried, should we be worried? Oh, yeah. That trumpet might sound any moment. We'll be taken to heaven, and the whole thing kicks off. It's all ready to go. All ready to go. Martyrdom, which God has spoken a lot about in these last few chapters. You read Revelation and everybody's a martyr. Everybody's a martyr. It's going to increase. When you get into chapter 13, that martyrdom just continues. Generally, we didn't know a lot about martyrdom, but now we're getting to see and hear it. Where those folks took those 240 families and chopped their heads off because they were Christian people. Pretty sad. Why? Because they would not renounce Christ. They could have simply said, Jesus who? And been okay. But because they would not renounce Christ, suddenly they become martyrs in heaven who sit there and say to God, how long are you going to put up with this? Until finally God says, you know what, you're right, I'm done. Show them the big projector in the sky. Let's get this thing done. Let's kick the devil out of heaven and send him back down there where he belongs. And then we'll start the time clock at the last 3.5 years. Boom. This is our story to people, though. This is what we have to be telling folks about. The only thing that's going to keep them out of hell, the only thing that's going to keep them out of the devil's hand, the cross. Will they listen? No. I have seen thousands of people come to Jesus Christ, but I've had tens of thousands reject him. It's hard. It's hard. And you have to live a life, and you have to stay vigilant. You have to be concerned with those that you work with and those that you go to school with and everywhere, everybody. Because you never know when God will say to you, here's an opportunity, why don't you talk to that person? And when God says to you, talk to that person, take advantage of it and talk to that person. Because you'd be surprised how ready they are. Don't worry that you don't know it right. I say this all the time. First time the Lord said to me, talk to that person over there, I was in high school. The only verse I knew was Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. For by grace are you saved. Except it came out to me, for by works are you saved, not of grace. Lest any man should boast. But surprisingly, they didn't hear me. They heard Ephesians chapter 2 correctly. And they looked at me, these young people. We were just, I was 15, so I was in the 10th grade. And they looked at me and said, well, what do I got to do? I'm thinking to myself, how in the world they got here? I don't know. But I was able to lead them to Jesus. And every time the Lord says, talk to that one, you'd be surprised. But you have to be ready. If you know nothing more than John 3:16, let me tell you, you know everything when it comes to telling a soul how to get to heaven. Because it's all right in there. That's why everybody flashes John 3:16 everywhere. Yes, you'll get some rejection. Like I told you, my mother, who just passed away 2 weeks ago, went to heaven because she finally received Jesus as her Savior. But the first time I went, and I came home and I said, Mom, you wouldn't believe. She looked at me and said, you won't talk about that in this house. 5 years later, I'm talking to her on the phone. I'm stationed in Pearl Harbor. I call Mom on the phone to see how she's doing. She says, you know what, son? I wish I had what you have. Went to the captain, got permission to go home, led my mama to Jesus. Took 5 years. Was it worth it? Oh, sure. Because all these years later now, when she closed her eyes, she met Jesus. And it was worth it. Learn John 3:16 if you learn nothing else. And should the Lord say to you, hey, my time is quick, I'm coming soon. Yes, they're going to think you're foolish for sharing it with them, but share it anyway. Share it with them. If all you got is John 3:16, I guarantee it's more than enough. It's more than I had. It's more than I had. Let's all stand.